There's also a big vote at play today for Canada to try and garner a seat at the UN Security Council. That vote has already gotten underway. We'll get some results later today. 2 seats up for grabs and 3 contenders, Canada being one of them. All right, I'm going to bring in my colleagues right away because we are expecting the Prime Minister to come out shortly. And I'm going to start with David Cochrane today, if you guys don't mind, because David, you were the one that broke this news about an economic update coming soon.
Yeah, we're going to get a fiscal and economic update of some sort in July. This is something that the Prime Minister has been under pressure to deliver, the Finance Minister has been under pressure to deliver, and pressure that they have dismissed so far, saying things like it would be an exercise in invention and imagination. Well, now it's going to be an exercise in Parliament in July when the Finance Minister will give us a fiscal update. Now, what we don't know is just how robust or how significant this fiscal update will be, because there hasn't been a budget that was supposed to happen in late March. That got shelved as the coronavirus spread around the world and the country went into lockdown and plans kind of got sideswiped by this global public health emergency. So there isn't a budget to update. The question is how robust will this fiscal update be? The government has been adamant that there is too much uncertainty and too much inability to give the sort of clear kind of really detailed update that we normally see in the fall of the year with a spring budget. I'm looking for 2 things from the Prime Minister when he confirms this news in his public statements is when exactly will be, and just how thorough and significant will be, and really what changed from a week ago when you said this was impossible to do in any kind of a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think his other words were it would be highly unreliable, or other words that he's used in the past. I'd say a couple things. A fiscal update is not even required to happen in Parliament, so if they don't want to do it on one of the days that Parliament is supposed to come back, they certainly don't have to. Vashi, what are you hearing about what this picture might show? And I'd also just point out Saskatchewan has done a budget recently, and Quebec has an update coming towards the end of the week.
Yeah, and it's interesting, and just on the date, I'm told it'll be towards the beginning of July, because I know that is a question for a lot of people, given that Parliament is kind of coming to an end, or what Parliament looks like right now is coming to an end. It's interesting that you bring up Saskatchewan, Rosie, because I actually talked to Premier Moe last night, interviewed him on the show, and his government was receiving a lot of criticism from the opposition in that province for not painting a long-term enough picture. Basically, his budget only goes to the end of March next year, and the opposition was saying, well, you're not really laying out here how you're going to deal with all this increased spending. Do you plan on raising taxes? He said he doesn't, but do you plan on, how are you going to tackle this? And I imagine what I'm told, or at least being telegraphed to me, is that this will be more of a snapshot. I don't know if it necessarily will fit into the construct of what we expect in a normal fiscal update. Obviously it won't, because it's going to present a range of scenarios and there is great uncertainty, but I'm kind of being told it might not necessarily please the opposition. It's not going to satisfy what they've been asking for. So I too, like David, am looking to see from the Prime Minister a bit more detail about what exactly they might present. I'm guessing those details will probably come from the Finance Minister, Bill Morneau, as well, who I think is going to speak publicly a bit later today on the same subject. But I think, given the amount of pressure on the federal government, what they have said about why they can't do this, I think they're not going to be able to do a total 180 and say, actually, things aren't really uncertain anymore, because it would certainly be very different than what they've said in the past. So I expect that to inform exactly what they present at the beginning of July. I should also mention that Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet had signaled earlier this week that he was predicating at least some of his support today, not just on there isn't just one vote at the UN, there's a big vote, there's a couple of big votes in the House of Commons too, and he would, it doesn't sound like he's going to support them anyway, but he was earlier this week saying, you've got to have a fiscal update in order for me to even consider supporting the government on their supplementary estimates today, the confidence votes today. So a lot of political pressure, as well as people like former budget watchdog Kevin Page, the former parliamentary budget officer, all saying there should be some sort of update. Give us a range of scenarios, but give us something.
Yeah, and a fiscal update can be as little as, here's what we've spent to date, or here's what we've authorized in spending today. Here's what we estimate the deficit to be at, which the current PBO has said at least $260 billion. Here's where the federal debt is at. Here's what the debt to GDP ratio looks like. It doesn't have to be, here's all of our spending for the next 12 months. It can be, here's what things look like in the current context, and here's why we are worried or aren't worried. it doesn't have to be a vast document, is what I would say. I mean, I've had economic updates that are like 8 pages long. So,
well, and Rosie, one thing they might be able to do with this economic update is you'll have a line of demarcation, a split when the emergency support money will be included in this, and then the stimulus recovery money will be recorded afterwards. So you can look at it and see how much of this is because of the emergency and how much of this is because of the recovery, which helps with long-term fiscal analysis.
Okay, here's the Prime Minister now, and again, that confidence motion Vashi was talking about happening later this afternoon.
I want to recognize the great work that all of Team Canada has done ahead of today's United Nations Security Council vote. We're running for the Security Council seat because we saw a unique opportunity to engage with our partners across the UN to build sustainable peace and to make real progress on the issues that matter. Around the world, people want many of the same things: clean air, a real shot at success, a fair economy, and a just society. And to make that happen, we have to work together, today and every day. That is something that our government is ready to do. At the beginning of the year, I don't think anyone could have predicted what the coming months would hold. COVID-19 is truly an unprecedented challenge. And right from the start, it was clear that we needed to put everything we had on the table in response. So that's exactly what our government did. In the space of a few weeks, we introduced the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. We created loans for small businesses and put in place support for specific sectors that have been hardest hit. We rolled out help for seniors, for students, for families. At every step of the way, we kept Canadians up to date about what we were doing to respond. Taken together, we've now introduced the largest economic measures in our lifetimes, measures that are helping millions of people, because that's what the situation demanded. Now, as we begin to safely and gradually restart, I know people are wondering what this pandemic will mean for their jobs in the long run and what the impact has been on our economy and on our path forward. We hear that, and we want to make sure that you have the best information possible. So today, I can announce that in the House of Commons on July 8th, our government will be releasing an economic and fiscal snapshot. This will give Canadians a picture of where our economy is right now, how our response compares to that of other countries, and what we can expect for the months to come. Later today, Minister Morneau will formally announce in Parliament that we will be presenting this economic and fiscal snapshot.
From the beginning of this crisis, we knew that COVID-19 represented an unprecedented challenge for our country. So our response had to reflect that. In just a few weeks, our government introduced a whole series of measures to help people get through this difficult time. We introduced the Emergency Response Benefit and the Emergency Wage Subsidy. We provided loans to small businesses and gave targeted support to sectors that had been hardest hit by the crisis. Whether you're a student or retired, with or without a job, we wanted to be there for you. As we now start to reopen the economy, a lot of people are wondering what to expect in the coming months and what this crisis will mean for our economy. That's why today we are announcing that our government will publish a snapshot of our economic and fiscal situation on July 8th in the House of Commons. That will give us an idea of the state of the economy and how our response compares to that of other countries and what we can expect in future. Later today, Minister Morneau will be informing Parliament that that will occur. Adopting measures to mitigate the consequences of the crisis on our economy is only part of the challenge. We are also working very hard to ensure that hospitals and frontline workers have the equipment and all the material that they require. And on that note, I have some good news to share with you. First, our government has signed an agreement with the Montreal company Galanas to produce silica microbeads that are essential for testing. And this week, Health Canada also certified ventilators produced by two Canadian groups, CAE and the Consortium Ventilators for Canadians. They now will be able to ramp up their production to produce the 20,000 ventilators that have been ordered. 2 years ago, I was at CAE to announce an investment in worker training. Today, we're seeing why it is so important to support not only talent, but innovation here at home.
Researchers across the country make incredible discoveries every day, from rapid advances in understanding COVID-19 over the last few months to years-long studies of climate change and cancer treatments. It's in everyone's interest that they continue doing their vital work. So today, we're announcing almost $500 million in funding through NSERC's additional annual Discovery Grants program. This money will support thousands of Canadian researchers and their groundbreaking work, whether they're studying viruses, developing AI, or making strides in chemical engineering. Canadians are innovative and creative, and that's something we'll always support. This morning, I want to speak about help for another group of Canadians who do vital work, our fish and seafood producers. The women and men who work on fishing boats and in processing plants keep our families fed. But they've been facing some really tough times lately. That's why, in the next week, we're opening applications for 2 additional programs to support the sector. As of today, the Canadian Fish and Seafood Opportunities Fund is available to help producers access new markets, reach new customers, and maintain a foothold internationally. Canada's seafood is among the best in the world, and this fund will help spread the word. On Monday, processors will also be able to apply for help through the Canadian Seafood Stabilization Fund we created this spring. The fund will provide support for everything from buying PPE to keeping workers safe to purchasing freezers so products stay good while producers find buyers.
Today, we are announcing the reopening of the Canadian Fish and Seafood Opportunities Fund. This program will help seafood producers to access new markets, serve new clients, and retain their presence on international markets. And Monday, processors will also be able to apply for funding under the Canadian Seafood Stabilization Fund that we created earlier this spring. This is support that they can use for many things, including buying individual protective equipment, protecting their employees, or buying freezers in order to preserve their products if it takes longer than usual to find buyers.
I want to end today with an update on Parks Canada. For a lot of people, no summer is complete without getting the tent packed, the kids in the car, and the time off to go camping. Now, because of the pandemic, many campgrounds had to close temporarily. But the good news is that as of Monday, Parks Canada will gradually start reopening some of their camping sites. No matter what you're planning this summer, whether it's camping or barbecues, keep following public health recommendations and keep doing your part to protect the people around you. Together, we will get through this. Merci.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phones for questions. One question, one follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Première question, Marie Vastel, Le Devoir. À vous.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to come back to the extension of the CERB that you announced yesterday. A number of people, including François Legault and Chambers of Commerce, are concerned that this will just maintain the disincentive to work. And perhaps you should consider allowing people keep more of their work income. Now, at the time you said this was an emergency and you had to help people right away, and that's why you said it would not be changed. But now, 3 months later, don't you think you should take the time to adjust the CERB? Well, there are currently some 3 million Canadians who would like a job, who lost their job, and who are not finding any employment. Yes, we know that the economy is gradually reopening and that some jobs are being created. But the fact remains that there are still far too many people out there who are looking for a job without those jobs being available. So we have to be there to help those people who need support, who need the CERB in order to pay for groceries or support their families. Yes, we are encouraging people and bringing in measures to encourage people to take any jobs that become available, but we're very far from being in a situation where there are enough jobs for everyone who wants to work. And that's why we are extending the CERB for an additional 8 weeks. Follow up? Yes, I understand. That's something you've repeated a number of times over the last few days. But I want to ask the question, why would it be impossible to change the CERB? I know that there are people who still can't find work, but the question is not to not extend it, but perhaps to change it, to adapt it. And your Minister Qualtrough said that you intend to impose sanctions on fraudsters. So how do you intend to do that, since the bill did not go through? Well, I think it's important that people understand that in a crisis such as this one, we had to get the money out the door as quickly as possible, with as few checks as possible, with respect to people's individual circumstances, because those people needed the money quickly. And as we've said right from the very beginning, we want to ensure that the people who receive the CERB are not trying to defraud the system. Now, we understand and we saw that there are hundreds of thousands of Canadians who have already repaid some payments under the CERB that they should not have received. So the system is working. But unfortunately, there is a small number of criminals and fraudsters who have taken advantage of that system in order to collect that money, while others are supporting each other, and there will be consequences for those individuals.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. À vous.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. Last week, you were still saying that the situation in Canada was still too uncertain to provide an economic update. Now you're saying the reverse today. So what changed? Well, an economic update would in fact be unrealistic. An economic update includes projections of exactly what might happen in the coming months and years over a 3 to 5 year horizon. Obviously, we are not in a position to present that. But every 2 weeks, the Finance Department has been sharing all available information on the measures we've introduced, and we are certainly capable of bringing together that data and that information on what we're doing, with a couple of projections as to what could happen in the next few months. So that's why we are going to continue to be transparent and open, present a snapshot of the economy in a few weeks so that people can see what the state of the economy is now and what could happen in the coming week.
I've consistently said that an economic and fiscal update would be unrealistic right now because it automatically includes projections for a year, 3 years, 5 years ahead of time, which, quite frankly, we simply couldn't make any responsible predictions about. However, every 2 weeks over the past number of months, we have put forward all the information from Finance to the Finance Committee, to parliamentarians on the measures that we have moved forward on to give a very precise accounting on what we've done. We've continued to do that, and in a few weeks we will gather all that together along with a sense of where we are, comparisons to where we are compared to other countries, and some estimates on where we could be in the coming months. But this will not be an economic and fiscal update. It will be more of a snapshot or a portrait of where we are right now.
Suivi, Melanie?
Follow up?
Oui, donc si je comprends bien,
yes, so as I understand it, you're not going beyond a horizon of several months. So until when will we have an idea of the state of the economy? Well, the Minister of Finance is currently working on this. Obviously, we want to provide as much information as possible to people, but we also want that information to be helpful. So the Minister of Finance will be able to specify what that will include a little later.
Next question, operator.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Teresa Wright, the Canadian Press, line open.
Yes, good morning, Prime Minister. Just following up on what you just said in terms of the fact that you've said that uncertainty makes it impossible to provide a meaningful fiscal update. Given that, what is the value of this fiscal snapshot that's coming in July, given all that uncertainty that we face?
I think it'll be useful for people to see the scale and the details on everything that we have put out. As I've said, we've been keeping the Finance Committee and through them parliamentarians updated every 2 weeks on all the measures we've been flowing out, but at the same time pulling them all together in a look over the past few months on all the measures we've done, comparing the measures we've done in Canada to countries around the world. Some may have done better, some won't have done nearly as much. So we get a sense of where we are compared to others and a sense of what the coming weeks or months could look like. These are things that I think are useful for people to come together on. But because of the transparency we've demonstrated every step of the time, it is a consistent part of what we're continuing to do.
Follow up, Teresa?
Yes, on another issue, it often takes years for the RCMP to respond to formal recommendations from the force's civilian watchdog. Is this acceptable to you?
I think one of the things that we've seen come to light over the past weeks and months is that our systems are not adequate to respond to the concerns that racialized Canadians and Indigenous Canadians and others who want to see a reduction of systemic discrimination in our institutions move forward quicker. So we are going to move much quicker on responding to these things, on making changes to our institutions to really go after systemic discrimination. I
think that what we've been seeing for several weeks now is the speed at which our institutions are responding to complaints and to the need to change, and that change is too slow. It must be expedited.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Greg Quinn, Market News, line open.
Hello. Governments in the past have used omnibus bills to put a lot of side legislation into budget packages. When you do present a full budget, will you commit to refraining from using an omnibus bill to put in other measures?
We have been consistent in our approach over the past years of not moving forward with omnibus legislation. These are things that we are fairly strict on. It's something that we saw previous Conservative governments significantly abuse, which is why we made commitments to not have omnibus legislation, and we're going to be sticking with that.
We saw in past Conservative governments abuse omnibus bills. There were many measures included in them that were not connected to the specific goals of the bill or the budget. And that's why we have limited the number of measures within this legislation so that we can have a better debate in Parliament, and we will continue to take that approach.
Yes. The unemployment rate is at a record high, and clearly the CERB program shows millions of people in Canada had savings that weren't enough to last even a couple of months through a time like this. Given the rise in gig employment and tech companies, do we have to take another look at social programs or regulation or taxation of these kinds of gig employers when we get through this tough moment?
I think Absolutely, Greg. That's something that we need to look at. We've seen this crisis expose real vulnerabilities within our communities, within our employment systems. We are responding to this emergency right now, but we are also reflecting very carefully on how we can build back better, build back fairer, build back greener, make changes to our systems so that going forward, whether there's another pandemic or some other crises, or not, that people are better supported by our systems. We need to make sure that we're doing right by Canadians, and this crisis has given us not just examples of where we haven't been good enough in the past as governments, but opportunities to make significant changes. Je pense absolument que nous devons
I absolutely believe that we have to look at all our systems to see if we can improve them. This pandemic has exposed flaws in our system in terms of its treatment of the most vulnerable, and I think this gives us an opportunity to make changes for the better and rebuild our country and systems that will be fairer and more generous towards the most vulnerable. So this is a great opportunity for everyone. If there are other pandemics, or if we go back to normal, whatever the situation, we need to do more for vulnerable Canadians.
For Global News, you've said July 8th there will be a fiscal snapshot. I'm wondering what specifically it will include, what sorts of numbers, and if this is a means to appease the opposition who've been asking for a fiscal update.
Over the past number of months, we have put forward in full transparency updated numbers every 2 weeks to the Finance Committee on measures that we've put forward. So our commitment to transparency has been ongoing, as has been the case for this government since the very beginning. At the same time, it will be useful to pull together all these different measures so people understand the scale of what this country has done, some comparators with other countries so that they can see where we fit on the spectrum of help to citizens in our peer countries, but also a sense of what could be expected in the coming months. I think it would be a little bit unrealistic to project much further than a few months because things are changing so rapidly, but we're happy to continue to demonstrate the kind of transparency and accountability that Canadians expect and deserve. Je pense que ça va être intéressant de pouvoir rassembler toutes les informations qu'on partage à tous les 2 semaines avec le comité des finances.
All the information at the Finance Department with respect to our investments and the resources we're providing to Canadians. But at the same time, it will be a chance to compare ourselves to other countries to see where we are with respect to our support for Canadians. And it will also give people an idea of what the next weeks or months could hold without necessarily providing long-term predictions. And we continue to focus on transparency.
Different topic. Earlier today, the Bloc Québécois leader said that you were governing like a king, that you have no respect for Parliament and you are doing nothing for Quebec. I'd just like to get your response to that.
As we know, this is a minority parliament, so decisions about whether Parliament sits and how we move forward need to be made on a consensus or on a majority basis in the Parliament, which is why a number of weeks ago we worked with other parties and got an agreement to continue to focus on the COVID-19 crisis, but expand the rules so people could be asking questions on any topics and ensure that we have accountability moments and times for the Parliament to return throughout the summer, including on July 8th, where we'll be presenting a fiscal update. So, 3 different parties came together to make a determination of what Parliament would do. That's how Parliament functions. I can understand that both the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives did not want this particular outcome, but the will of Parliament was expressed by a majority, by the 3 parties who came together to determine what we're doing. That's how Parliament works. And if every time something doesn't go their way, an opposition party cries, "Oh no, it's a dictatorship!" all of a sudden, it's sort of irresponsible, and it undermines, I think, the strength of our democracy that we've been able to show through this crisis, the strength of our institutions that continue to do really important work, not just to help Canadians during this crisis, but to remain accountable and engaged in our democratic processes.
En français, s'il vous plaît.
Je pense que c'est
I think it's extremely important to point out that the current situation in Parliament was debated and voted on by the majority of parliamentarians. There are three parties that came together to determine that, yes, we were going to have a COVID-19 committee, broadened question period, so that more parliamentarians could ask questions on any issue and come back 4 times during the summer, including in July for this economic snapshot. And I think that's the way a parliament is supposed to work. A minority parliament, in that type of minority parliament, no party alone can decide how things will work. We need to collaborate, and the fact is that a majority of members of parliament agreed with that approach. Unfortunately, the Bloc Québécois and the Conservatives were not happy with that conclusion. They didn't like the majority decision of Parliament. But if every single time that someone doesn't get what they want in a minority parliament, they start to say, well, this is nothing but a dictatorship, well, I think that's a bit ridiculous, first of all. And second of all, it undermines people's confidence, the confidence people should have in our institutions that are serving Canadians very, very well. Now, we brought in 4 bills in the last few months to help Canadians, and we have also shown just how well our democracy and our institutions are continuing to operate. That should reassure Canadians that even in a crisis, we're working very well as a democracy. Radio-Canada, with respect to the seat on the UN Security Council, you have invested a great deal personally in this, a lot of political capital. You've said Canada is back. What happens if we lose? What if you don't get that permanent seat? Do you believe it will be your fault personally? Well, for the last 5 years, Canada has been much more deeply engaged in the world, whether it's through our initiatives in Paris on climate change, whether it's in the G7, or whether it's in protecting our oceans and addressing sexual equality in the world. In our work in many multilateral institutions has shown that Canada continues to be deeply engaged in developing priorities for ourselves and for developing countries, particularly developing countries that need more funding and better institutions in a situation such as this. So Canada is working very well within the multilateral system and has been for the last 5 years. The seat on the UN Security Council is an additional means of ensuring that our voice will be heard. Our actions will continue, whatever the result in the coming days. We know that an engaged Canada is good for the rest of the world, but it's also good for Canadians. It's in our own interests to have stable and predictable rules around the world. It's in our own interests to have support out there for vulnerable people through education and economic progress for people around the world, because Canada succeeds when everyone else in the world succeeds. That's what we've been doing for 5 years, and that's what we will continue to do, whether we're on the Security Council or not. If we are there, it will be easier to have our voice heard, but our engaged approach will not change.
I think one of the things we've seen over the past 5 years is Canada has stepped up on the world stage, whether it's been on the fight against climate change through our oceans and through support for small island developing states, as well as climate financing internationally, whether it's been on women, peace and security with our impacts on the new Vancouver Principles on peacekeeping, whether it's moving forward on financing for development with developing countries, looking at our international financial institutions, the Bretton Woods structures that have lasted and kept us so well for 75 years, but need to be modified. Canada has continued to be a strong voice on the world stage because this is what Canada does well, and we will continue to do it. yes, a seat on the UN Security Council will be an additional lever and an extra way that Canada can make sure that our voice and our values are being heard at the highest levels. But we will continue to make a difference in the world and defend multilateralism, not just because it's good for the world, but because it's good for Canadians. Canadians do well when we are connected to the world, when we are trading with the world, when there are clear rules in place for things like international trade and international behaviors. We do well when countries come together to work collaboratively and respectfully on solving big problems. We do well when vulnerable people around the world have better opportunities to succeed and fewer conflicts and fewer social inequities. These are the things that Canada has been doing for the past 5 years. These are the things that we will continue to do into the future, regardless of what happens this week. But it certainly would be nice to be able to have that extra lever of a seat on the Security Council.
Je suis plus sûr de comprendre. Là. Je vous demandais, est-ce qu'il y a une partie qui va être de votre faute personnelle là-dedans?
I was asking you whether part of it would be your own fault if you don't get a seat. Now, on the long-term care facilities, the soldiers have been there. There have been problems there. Is there an agreement with Quebec now? How many volunteers from the Canadian Red Cross will be going in there? Can you clearly explain what's happening? Because it's important to know what's occurring in these homes. Well, I can tell you that we have been continuing our very productive discussions with Quebec. There's always a lot of great collaboration between the federal government and Quebec, and we'll have announcements to make on that very soon.
This fiscal snapshot that you're going to be releasing, if you're doing this, does this mean that the big spending announcements have now all been made? And if not, I mean, how reliable will this be? Also, when do you think you're going to be in a position to actually put forward a fiscal update or a budget?
I think, first of all, we know that we are moving through the emergency phase right now into something that is more of a recovery phase. We will continue to monitor what is needed in the economy as we go forward on extending certain programs, on modifying others. But as we've been doing from the beginning, we will keep adjusting as we go. I think it is useful to bundle together all the initiatives and all the ways we've helped Canadians over the past months in one concrete snapshot in a few weeks. But of course, we recognize that if there is a second wave, if Canadians fall on hard times because of COVID-19 in the coming months, we will need to do more. We are going to remain focused on making sure that Canadians are able to get through this in the best possible way, to be able to keep ourselves and our families safe, but also to be able to make sure we have a strong economy going forward. So yes, now is a natural time for bundling together everything that we've done with this fiscal snapshot. But certainly as we move forward, we will continue to be transparent about decisions big and small we have to take to continue to keep Canadians safe. As for when there would be a full fiscal update or an eventual budget, right now we're still very much responding to an immediate situation, and we will continue to reflect on when that time could be right as the situation stabilizes. Je pense que évidemment, on est en train de passer.
We are moving now from the emergency to a reopening economy, so it's perfectly logical that we should provide information about all the measures we brought in over the last few months. Now, that does not mean that there will not be other initiatives introduced if there's a second wave or if we need to extend certain programs. But it is logical to share a picture of where we are now in Canada with Canadians. With respect to the next steps, a budget or a more formal economic update, we continue to look at the situation, and when the economy is stable enough to do that, we will.
And you were asked this a little earlier. I'd like to give you another opportunity to answer. How much do you have personally riding on this UN Security Council vote?
I think this is something that Canadians expect for us to be involved in the world, and I've certainly seen the impact that Canada can have on the world stage through the G7, through the G20, through our leadership in multilateral fora at a time where there are large countries sort of withdrawing a little bit from the global stage. I believe deeply that Canada can and should be stepping up on the world stage, and I've demonstrated that Canadians can and do have a large impact on the world when we do that over the past 5 years. I certainly look forward to being able to continue that, and do see that the UN Security Council seat could be a very powerful tool for continuing what we're doing. But as I've said from the beginning, a seat on the UN Security Council is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. It's a means to continue ensuring that our values, that our voice, and that our solutions are heard and resonating at all levels of multilateralism.
As I've noted many times, a seat on the UN Security Council is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end, a way of ensuring that Canadian values and solutions can continue to resonate on the world stage. I think people have seen just what kind of positive impact Canada has had on the world in the last 5 years, and I hope to continue that with a seat on the Security Council. However, whatever the result of the vote is, we will continue to be there and to be engaged with the rest of the world, because it's good for Canadians to have a more stable world where people follow the rules.
CTV News. Prime Minister, you've listed many things Canada's done internationally on the world stage, but we know that for members, UN members that are voting today on the Security Council seat, two key factors are commitments to peacekeeping and amount of percentage of GDP dedicated to foreign aid. How do you think Canada has done on those two measures compared to the two countries we're competing against?
I think there's always more to do, and we're always looking at how Canada can better help, how Canada can best help on the world stage. But right now, what we're seeing in the world is challenges to the multilateral system, with large countries withdrawing a little bit their support for positive engagement on the world stage. It is a time for medium-sized countries who can have a big voice to step up, and that's why Canada's voice on the UN Security Council could be a strong lever for continuing the defense of the multilateral system we're in and improvements to that multilateral system. I have nothing but respect for our two competitors, Ireland and Norway, that have demonstrated an engagement in the world. There's no question about it, and it is unfortunate that we're in a situation of having to compete against friends for this. But I know that Canada has a particular ability to convene voices from around the world, to move forward in ways that are connected to every country around the world through our diaspora, a voice that is consistent and strong in its values, and is really necessary on the world stage right now. We need to have strong voices that are there to speak for others, not just for themselves, and Canada has consistently done that, and that's why I am optimistic about the process we're in. I
think it's important to say that Canada has a special contribution to make with its diversity, its international engagement. We are large enough as a country to make a difference, but small enough to know that we cannot do everything alone. And that is our strength and has been for many years. Now, certainly Ireland and Norway are allied countries, and they have had a very positive impact on the world. But Canada has a special strength to contribute, which is even greater than those two countries through our membership in the G7, the G20, the Francophonie, the Commonwealth, the Organization of American States, etc., and OPEC. We have been present at so many different tables that we are able to bring people together to ensure that a a positive voice can be heard, a voice that often is not heard, because sometimes the large countries are more worried about themselves than others.
A hub city for the NHL's return to play, provided they can get agreement from local authorities. But the 14-day quarantine for people crossing the Canada-U.S. border is still a rate-limiting step towards that, and it's the same rule that's kept people from being able to go to family weddings, funerals even. What are you proposing? What are you considering with respect to hockey players? Are you going to consider making them essential workers, or are you going to create some other kind of waiver for them that would allow them to enter the country without the 14-day quarantine?
We will be making announcements around this at the appropriate time, but we're working with local health authorities, provincial health authorities, and the NHL to make sure that regardless of the measures in place, Canadians are kept safe, and our focus is on community safety throughout. There are ways that we can ensure that the principles are respected in a way that makes sense for the NHL, and those are what the conversations are. But we are, as I said, open to making arrangements as long as the principles of keeping Canadians safe, first and foremost, and preventing the spread of COVID-19 are respected. I
think that even if we'd all like to see some hockey played this summer, we have to focus on the principle of protecting Canadians and preventing the spread of COVID-19. That's why we have been working with the NHL and provincial authorities and local authorities on measures that will make it possible for the NHL to play, knowing that at every step of the way we will not be risking the health of Canadians.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
All right, that is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Wednesday, giving us a number of bits of news there, and namely, as David Cochran reported earlier, that there will be not an economic update. He's not using that word. He's using fiscal snapshot, which seems to be something quite more limited than what an economic update will be, but it will be done inside the House of Commons on July 8th. I'll bring back Vashi and David to talk about that and more. Vashi, I think that's done very specifically so that we don't have certain expectations around what we're going to get July 8th, that it's not going to be as complete as an economic update would be.
Yeah, the Prime Minister was pretty specific and even in his terminology, and I think that's why prior to the announcement this morning, I was getting all these signals from the government that the opposition probably won't be satisfied with what they announced today, and it wasn't a full 180 from what they had telegraphed earlier when they were insisting that it was way too uncertain to do a fiscal update, so they're calling it a fiscal snapshot instead, and the Prime Minister's explanation for that obviously revolved around the uncertainty, the fluidity right now. But he said that there would be some projections, a few projections, I think was exactly what he said, going a number of months out, but certainly nothing that goes into a number of years out. I am anticipating that that will not satisfy the opposition who were looking. I don't think necessarily, I mean, it depends which party you're asking for, weren't looking for, certainty 3 years from now what's going to happen, but a little bit of a plan as to how this government is thinking about what they're going to do after this is all over, or through the midpoint of how this all works out. I think what I took from what the Prime Minister said was that, from his view, that was not possible. Because, again, of that uncertainty. But what we would see instead was a sort of tally of everything that they've done so far, information that they already present to the Finance Committee, he said, every 2 weeks. So we know what programs, the CERB, the wage subsidy, all of those things, how much have those cost so far, how much do they anticipate they will end up costing, and then, what that looks like a few months from now. The one thing that maybe we can garner from that information when it comes out, I think a lot of people are interested to see what happens beyond the summer in particular, and that is because yesterday the government announced that the CERB will continue for an extra 2 months, and the wage subsidy they had announced earlier is going to continue again. They've extended that till the end of the summer. We don't really have an indication for many of these programs what happens after, or what happens into the fall. And obviously we're all sitting around wondering if there's going to be a second wave and how that might affect the economy and the reopening process and all of that. So if in fact this update, the snapshot I should call it, does give us an indication, does tell us that they are not planning to continue the CERB beyond that, or they are not going to continue with the wage subsidy, or they are going to reduce the amount of money they think it will cost, that means that the program might be amended, or that's what they're thinking. That would at least I think, provide parliamentarians and Canadians with an idea of where the government thinks their aid packages are going. But short of that, I think, generally those who are calling for more robust transparency on these financial issues might be left a bit wanting by what the Prime Minister said today.
Yeah, and a couple other things. Fiscal snapshot, just so Canadians know, that's not something that is a common phrase around these parts. This is obviously something the government has come up with in order to describe what it is doing so that people don't think that they're going to get as complete a picture as they would if it was a budget or an economic update. I would also point out that July 8th, I think Parliament's sitting July 7th, if I'm not mistaken, for their COVID committee. You can correct me if I'm wrong, either of you, but July 8th, I'm not sure a lot of Canadians will be sitting around the TV waiting for this fiscal picture either. So I'm not sure, I guess I'm just not sure how much transparency is going to be there, given that that is sort of, the beginning of summer. People are focused on other things, and I would imagine there could potentially be some criticism there as well, David.
Well, Rosie, as a guy who sort of leads our coverage on the fiscal update every year, I'm not sure a lot of Canadians are sitting around waiting for the fiscal update in normal times. So this is going to be less than a fiscal statement. It's going to be more than a fiscal selfie. I'm not quite sure what the fiscal snapshot is. I mean, they do want us to have some expectations, but I think they want those expectations to be pretty low. It sounds like this is going to be a summary document, simply compiling what they've spent so far. And from the language the Prime Minister has used, I can't see a projection going out more than, say, 3 to 6 months, based on what he's saying here. And to give people an idea, what's in a fiscal update every year, you see 1-year projections, 3-year projections, 5-year projections, and all of those have the caveat of volatility, because you had, for example, I think in the last one, we had some civil unrest happening in Europe. The Yellow Vest movement was taking flight. There was slowing growth in China, and there was trade uncertainty with the United States, a gradual economic dampening around the EU caused by Brexit. All of these things throw significant volatility into the projections, but they still try to give you those horizons because they are at least a little bit more predictable in some ways than sort of what we're dealing with now, which is sort of a service-led recession, which we've never seen in the history of the world before, with the pandemic stacked on top of it, combined with a slightly now recovering oil shock. So the volatility is like nothing we've ever seen. The uncertainty is like nothing we've ever seen. So the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, who's now tweeted about it, essentially telling us we're going to get a fiscal update like nothing we've ever seen. And I think you're right. I think the opposition is not going to be satisfied with this. I'm not sure there would be much beyond a full budget that would satisfy them. But there is the reality that if you did do a fully robust, traditional sort of fiscal statement and dropped it in the House of Commons on July 8th, by August 8th, it's probably completely out of date, and certainly by September 8th or October 8th. So this is the challenge here. I think it's good that they're going to do some sort of a summary so people can get a clear sense of where things are in this emergency phase, as the Prime Minister describes it, as we prepare to glide into or launch into this recovery phase. And that lets you look at the toll of the emergency measures versus the deficit toll of the recovery measures, and then sort of you can assess the efficacy of all of those and whether they worked or not, and whether they've gone from just being one-time deficits or maybe to structural deficits, which is certainly the deep concern. I think we could also expect to see the borrowing, the interest rate bite from the borrowing, Rosie, historic low interest rates, something like that. You'd certainly want to see over a 5-year horizon or a 10-year horizon what they think the extra debt servicing costs of all of this spending would be. But it also seems to me this is going to be a little bit like the modeling we got from Dr. Tam and Dr. New on the COVID projections, that people wanted it, and when they got it, they realized just how imprecise it was. I get the sense there might be something like that coming next month.
Yeah, and I should, Vashi and Phil have both sent me texts. It is July 8th. The House is expected to return, so it will be on the same day that the House is coming back anyway, that they will present this fiscal snapshot. I would also just point out for the Prime Minister to say that an economic update is highly unreliable, and then to turn around today and say he was presenting an economic update probably wouldn't have been coherent. So he obviously had to come up with this fiscal snapshot.
Well, and the other challenge, Rosie, if I can add it, is normally the fiscal update updates a full budget. right? So you have a much larger document that builds off. And
yeah, sometimes.
We haven't had a budget in over a year.
Sometimes it's just a fall statement if there's been an election, for instance. Okay,
right.
I'm going to leave it both there with both of you for now. I'll come back if you don't mind and talk about another story that I know a lot of people actually have been waiting for, because churches, mosques, and synagogues, temples have started to reopen in places across the country. Some of you have already gone back to your faith-based practices, and in Ontario, Catholic churches are starting to welcome parishioners for public mass, and it starts today, but it's pretty much everything else. It's not going to look quite the same as it did before. Cardinal Thomas Collins is the Archbishop of Toronto, the country's largest Catholic archdiocese, and he joins me now. Cardinal, nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
So this has been difficult, I would imagine, not just for you, but for parishioners to not be in a common place together, celebrating, praying, especially at a time when you might need that even more.
No, that's very true. We can do something. We've been live streaming Mass every day, and of course, Mass has been celebrated individually by the priests every day. But not to be able to be present is a great loss, a great sacrifice. And also for us in our Catholic tradition, not even to be able to come to church and pray before the Eucharist, before the Blessed Sacrament, it's been a great sacrifice. And I'm so glad that this morning, 7:30, I celebrated Mass as I've been doing for the last 91 days. Live stream, but there were people there as well. So I was able to give communion. Oh my, not an empty church. There's people.
Well, that's lovely. That's lovely for you. That's lovely for you. But tell me what it looked like then, because obviously I'm not sure at 7:30, frankly, on a Wednesday it'd be packed, but on a Sunday, everyone's packed in the pews. It's fairly busy. So how are things going to be different now?
Well, it is that all the churches are divided out into 6-foot sections, a marker every 6 feet and so on, with lines on the floor. When we come up to receive Holy Communion, there's 6-foot apart markers where you stop and so on. And so there are fewer people. The limit in Ontario is 30%, but if you divide any church into 6-foot units, you're not going to get anywhere near even 30%. Although some people, if it's a family, they can sit together at one of the points. But if everyone's individual, it'd be much lower. But they were there. There were, I don't know, the cathedral seats about 1,100. I'd say there'd be maybe 100 people there this morning, spread out all over the whole area. It was so good to see.
I bet it was. And what about mask wearing and sanitizing your hands and the things that we're having to do when we go out to other places? Are you doing that too?
Absolutely. When people come into church, they're sanitize their hands. When they're in the church, they're more than 6 feet apart from one another. But when they come up to communion, since they're going from one place after another with someone who's been before, they wear the mask. I celebrate the Mass, all the priests celebrate the Mass without a mask because that makes some sense. But we're more than 20 feet away from the people. But when I went down to distribute communion, I sanitized my hands, put on the mask, went down, I would say the body of Christ, and 6 feet away, the person would say, Amen. Then they'd step forward, I give them communion without touching their hand. They step aside, take off the part of the Mass, receive communion. So we have all of those things in place to be very sure and careful that we care for one another. That's part of our faith as well.
Yeah, I didn't even think about communion and how complicated that might be, but it sounds like you've got that figured out. Have you been talking to other faith leaders in the community, mosques or temples or what have you, to see if they have to share best practices? Have you all had any conversations like that?
Not formally, but Catholic Church, all the bishops of Ontario put together an astonishing document. I mean, I'm amazed. I didn't write it, but I'm amazed with medical advice, and it's over 50 pages, called Worship Safe. We put it on our website so everyone's free to adapt what they want from it. And we have a shorter form of the key points that we use as the manual. We got videos and stuff of how to do that. They're all on our website. Anyone who wants to borrow them, use them, they're most welcome. But I haven't actually had direct conversations, except I was on a kind of a conference call, like a video call, with a bunch of various religious leaders sponsored by one of the members of Parliament, or MPP. And so in that case, we also had Minister McNaughton, Monty McNaughton, who's the liaison with the religious group. So we had in that way kind of a interchange.
Right. So you did your first Mass this morning at 7:30. You said that you had about 100 people, which is pretty good for a 7:30 on a Wednesday during a pandemic, I must say. And you said it was nice to see them. What was your message to them after having not seen people face to face in so long, and how did it feel for you?
Well, I didn't speak directly about the pandemic, although after the Mass for the last 3 months, we've been praying the rosary for people who are suffering. We say a special prayer from Pope Francis for people who are suffering in the pandemic. I just talked about the gospel and the first reading, and I've been doing that for 3 months now. So it wasn't specifically on that. But before giving communion, I gave an instruction on how to do it. And I must say, I think it went fine. I didn't notice any aberration in the thing at all. Everyone was 6 feet apart. It went very well.
Good.
So,
and you felt good too. I know that you are able to pray in private and quietly, and you don't need a crowd. But it must have been. Tell me how you felt seeing people there anyway.
It was so good. In a sense, the thing that most got me excited was on Sunday. We did we're going in gradually. For 3 days now, we've had private prayer allowed in the church, but not the celebration Mass. But I've been celebrating Mass beforehand with the people live streaming. And it was so much joy on Sunday. At the end of Mass, I went down the aisle with the other priests, opened the gates of the cathedral, opened the doors, opened the gates, and there were it was a small group of people that come for private prayer. He said, "Welcome home. Come, let us adore him." We all walked in. And I just was so moved by that. And then we've had these 3 days of prayer. Now we're starting Mass. So the Sunday Mass, of course, has many more people, but again, all very carefully regulated.
Well, Cardinal, I know that you and other faith leaders right now are anxious to be back at work and anxious to see people there, and people need it a lot right now. So I wish you well. Stay healthy. Stay 2 meters apart from everybody. But good luck on Sunday when there should be a good turnout too. Appreciate it.
You so much. God bless.
And to you. Thanks, Archbishop. That's Archbishop Thomas Collins. He's head of Toronto's Catholic Archdiocese. Churches opening today, but mosques, temples, and other faith-based celebratory areas have opened up across the country. And a lot of people were anxious for that to happen in Ontario as well. We're coming up to the top of the hour, noon Eastern here. This is CBC News Network, and I'm Rosemary Barton in Ottawa. We've just heard from the Prime Minister just not long ago, confirming that the government will, in fact, give a, quote, fiscal snapshot of the state of the economy since the pandemic struck on July 8th inside the House of Commons. This is not, the Prime Minister made it very clear, a full economic update. Instead, it will present some of the spending to date, how we are doing compared to other countries, and perhaps give us some projections over the next couple of months. Should point out that in this city as well, the Liberal government faces a confidence vote later today inside the House of Commons, and this around key government spending estimates that have to be approved inside the House of Commons in order for that spending to go on with support of the NDP. We believe that that vote will indeed pass. And there's another big vote happening too, and this is for the government, certainly a lot at stake politically, but also for the entire nation. Canada at the United Nations is hoping to gain a temporary seat on the UN Security Council. Voting is underway. It is expected to wrap up a little bit later this afternoon. Canada is expected to cast its ballot later this hour. That is, of course, the United Nations you're seeing there in New York, but because of the pandemic, voting is staggered to make sure everybody is keeping safe and far enough away from one another. There are 2 rotating seats there up for grabs. Not sure who that is voting or if they would ever tell us, but anyway, so that, not Canada, anyway. Norway, Ireland, and Canada competing for those 2 seats right now. And the Prime Minister was asked a lot about that today in his press conference as well. And as we wait for the noon briefing with Cabinet Minister, my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapellis, and the CBC's David Cochrane. Let's talk a little bit about that UN bid. There is, I think a fair bit riding on it for the Prime Minister, although he's also made it very clear, Vashi, that regardless of the outcome, the relationship will continue. His government will continue to be present in other multilateral organizations. But he was asked, I thought, a very good question from Glenn McGregor of CTV when he said, well, lots of these votes that have come to tally are based on development money and peacekeepers. And we were talking about it in our earlier meeting today here in the Bureau, and Murray Brewster, we asked him, well, how many peacekeepers do we have? And it's something like 20 right now who are participating in United Nations peacekeeping missions. So if that is the weight that people put on this vote, it may not go that well for the government. But if it is other things, like the Prime Minister positioning Canada as this important voice on a multilateral platform and his personal relationships with world leaders, it might all work out for Canada.
Yeah, it's really interesting to try and figure out or determine, and it's a secret ballot, so probably we'll never know, but what various countries are using to assess or to make their determination ultimately about how they vote. And obviously this government, Norway and Ireland, have been making these pitches for the last 2 years, but as I try to get more information behind the scenes about how those pitches have evolved, certainly the pandemic has played into it. And you heard that through the Prime Minister's words today, amplifying sort of the reasoning for this is a belief in multilateral institutions and how they can best tackle situations like the one we're in right now, the significance, the importance of these kinds of institutions in times like this, and Canada's desire to amplify its own voice and amplify those institutions in turn. That seems to be the pitch almost underscored by the pandemic right now through the Prime Minister and through others who have been aiding in Canada's lobbying efforts. I just don't know if it will work. Ultimately, those points that you made and that Murray and to Glenn's question made are valid ones, right? We don't have a large peacekeeping presence. In fact, there was some criticism around what we did contribute to the mission in Mali, for example. When it comes to foreign aid, Norway spends 1% of its GDP, though Canada has long promised to get to that number, which is, of course, an aspirational goal determined by a number of multilateral organizations. It's not there right now. I think it's at 0.27 or 0.28. And in fact, it hasn't even really increased all that much as a function of GDP from the years prior with the previous government. So there are valid criticism. It just depends what people end up voting based on. And it also depends on how successful this sort of wooing campaign has been, which, as I mentioned yesterday, has certainly changed because of the pandemic. There's a virtual reception last night, not a real one, as there have been in so many other instances over the last 2 years. So I think there's a huge amount of different things that people are considering or countries are considering ultimately when they cast their ballot. Just from a technical point of view, we're showing those votes being cast. All my conversations with people behind the scenes, and you could kind of hear the couching in this, I think, with the Prime Minister. They really don't feel like they have a 100% grasp on how things will turn out, just given that even though you talk to all these people, I think the Prime Minister's had 60 conversations or more with other world leaders since the start of the pandemic about this. You try and figure out, are they going to, do you have their vote? They really do feel like it's not 100% either way. They anticipate that it will go to a second round because you need 2/3 of the vote to secure a seat. As you mentioned yesterday, Rosie, Norway's kind of thought to be a front runner, but really nobody I talk to seems to know exactly how it's going to unfold.
No, which isn't at all surprising, really. They do their best to gauge. But who did you have on last night? The Prime Minister of
Barbados.
Barbados.
We have Barbados' vote, yeah.
Yeah. So we've got one lockdown. And Phil is just telling me, my producer, that it'll be Minister Champagne, actually, who will cast Canada's vote today. And that'll happen between 12:30 and 1. So we'll keep our eyes out for him when he pops up. He did go down to New York to help with this final push, because obviously, as you point out, the pandemic has changed the campaign a lot. Many people, though, believe that the ambassador who is there, Marc-André Blanchard, has been a significant strength to Canada, certainly. But it will come down to also, where the world wants to sort of put some focus right now, whether they believe they need another North American ally, whether they want to see Europe have a bigger voice at the table. And of course, when we last tried for this back under the Conservatives and under Stephen Harper in 2010, we lost, and it was at the time viewed to be fairly embarrassing. I think it's fair to say for Canada, we lost to Portugal, a much smaller country with fewer resources. And this would be sort of, I don't know if it would be a vindication, but it would be certainly a win for this government, and in some ways a win for Canada again, David.
Yeah, it's interesting the challenge Canada faces, because the rhetoric from Canada sometimes does not match its effort. The effort often lags behind the rhetoric. You go back to Canada as back as the big sort of declaration right around the time they started this whole bid to get the seat on the United Nations Security Council. But then you see, as Vashi highlighted, the lack of real meaningful growth in foreign aid in a substantive way to match what the competitors for the seat are doing, and the state of where we are in peacekeeping. It was slow to get going into Mali, and then it wasn't quite at the level I think people anticipated that they would do. So there there is that challenge, because the soaring rhetoric all sounds great, right? Of you want to be this progressive voice. Canada's one of these hinged nations with trade agreements with North America, with Europe, with the Pacific Rim nations, or most of them with the notable exception of China. And they want to be this progressive voice at the table to bring Canadians' voice and Canada's values, to one of the premier arenas for multilateral initiatives. So you have that, and then, as our colleague Salima Shivji has reported, you have this sort of kind of crass level of campaigning that goes along with this too. Like Canada gave people Celine Dion tickets, Ireland gave people U2 tickets. I don't know if Norway gave people AHA tickets, but they're doing these sorts of things of getting. It's almost like the campaigns for the FIFA World Cup or for the Super Bowl, where you see like these sort of like base level gift packages that are kind of being done. So it's an interesting thing of the personal relationship of the Prime Minister and the personal brand of the Prime Minister, whether that helps as well, because he kind of did have that rock star moment when he came onto the stage in 2015 after he won the election, and is seen as one of these next generation of progressive leaders globally. But whether Canada has lived up to all of that and what it has done on the world stage to satisfy people, because let's face it, Ireland and Norway are meaningful contributors to the United Nations and a very tough competitive field for Canada to go up against. And I remember talking to a senior official about a year or two ago, Rosie, who expressed regret that Canada had even done this, because everything they did internationally was looked at through the lens of campaigning for the seat on the Security Council. So it's been a little bit of a challenge in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and good to remember that Ireland and Norway are also progressive countries, sort of in line with much of Canada's thinking, so it shouldn't be viewed as a rebuke, certainly, of Canada, but it would be, I think, a significant disappointment for the government. Okay, the press conference is getting underway, so let's go now. The Deputy Prime Minister, this is Theresa Tam, Chief Public Health Officer.
Including 8,213 deaths. And 61,443 people, or 62%, have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 2,216,730 people for COVID-19 to date. Over the past week, an average of 36,000 people were tested daily, with just over 1% test positive. These numbers again change quickly, and they are updated daily in the evenings on canada.ca/coronavirus. Yesterday, I reiterated that COVID-19 is still with us. So I'm starting today with my broken record about going out smart. What has brought the virus under control was our actions, and it will take all of us continuing with physical distancing and good hygienic practices to maintain that control. This means physical distancing 2 meters from others, even when outdoors, hand washing, and cough etiquette everywhere, and wearing a non-medical mask or facial covering when COVID-19 is still active in your area and you can't keep the 2-meter distance from others. With the ups and downs of COVID-19 pandemic, it can sometimes seem like our emotions are on their own trajectory, from concern and cautious awareness to frustration and fatigue, with a bit of hope thrown in here and there. Given the level of uncertainty and changes in our lives over these past months, this range of emotions is to be expected. There have been losses that have caused grief and things we've prevailed against that have given us hope. This is a lot to process, but it's something that we've all been through together, and sharing our experiences can help us work through loss and build on hope. On that note, today I want to highlight a new mental wellness campaign called Take That Step, which was launched this week by the Wellness Together Canada portal. The Take That Step campaign reminds us that we can take steps every day to improve our mental well-being, especially during difficult times. The Government of Canada funded Wellness Canada portal offers a wide range of resources, from information and self-assessment tools to the opportunity to chat with peer support workers and other mental health professionals. Resources are available for all ages, free of charge, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Wellness Canada portal reminds us that mental health is a journey, not a destination. We all have different needs, so whether you are struggling with problematic substance use or need help to manage stress, there are a range of immediate mental health and substance use supports, as well as resources to support and motivate you on your wellness journey. Having a full range of resources that are freely accessible online makes it that much easier to start your journey. So take that step today. Thank you. Merci.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tam. Et maintenant, je donne la parole à Dr. Howard New. Dr. New, s'il vous plaît.
And now for Dr. New. Dr. New, the floor is yours. Thank you. Good afternoon. As usual, we will begin with an update on the latest numbers for COVID-19. In Canada, there are now 99,467 cases, including 8,213 deaths and 61,443 people, or 62%, who have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 2,216,730 people for COVID-19 to date. Over the past week, an average of 36,000 people were tested daily, with just over 1% testing positive. These numbers change quickly and are updated daily in the evenings on canada.ca/coronavirus. Yesterday, we reiterated that COVID-19 is still with us, so we are starting today with repeating how to go out smart. These measures have allowed us to control the virus, and we need to continue with physical distancing and good hygiene practices to maintain that control. This means physical distancing 2 meters from others, even when outdoors, hand washing, and cough etiquette everywhere, and wearing a non-medical mask or face covering where COVID-19 is still active and you can't keep a 2-meter distance from others. With the ups and downs of the COVID-19 pandemic, it can sometimes seem like our emotions are on their own trajectory, from concern and cautious awareness to frustration and fatigue, with a bit of hope thrown in here and there. There's a lot of information to digest, and we're all in the same boat. Sharing our experience can help us to rebuild with hope. That said, today we would like to present a new mental wellness campaign. It's called Take That Step, which was launched this week by the Wellness Together Canada portal. The Take That Step campaign reminds us that we can take steps forward every day to improve our mental well-being, especially during difficult times. The Government of Canada-funded Wellness Canada portal offers a wide range of resources, from information and self-assessment tools to the opportunity to chat with peer support workers and other mental health professionals. Resources are available for all ages, free of charge, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We all have different needs, and with this portal, you have access to a wide range of supports, mental health support, as well as resources to support you and motivate you on your wellness journey. Having a full range of resources that are freely accessible online makes it easier to start your journey. Take that step today. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. New. And now, I will give the floor to Minister Anita Anand.
Christiane. Good afternoon. I will start today's procurement update by acknowledging the hard work of many organizations and businesses across the country who are diligently ensuring that their establishments are safe to reopen for customers and employees alike. Many of you built these organizations from scratch, and now you must reconstruct them for a very different world. Canadians across the country have done a tremendous job to flatten the curve and are now in a position to lay the foundations for an economic recovery. Nous devons toutefois être prudents.
However, we must be cautious. The potential for outbreaks remains, and a second wave could be just around the corner. For the doctors, nurses, and frontline healthcare workers, my department continues to be vigilant in procuring the vital supplies they need to keep themselves and all Canadians safe in the months and years ahead.
We are focused on ensuring that Canada is prepared when it comes to having enough personal protective equipment. As the demand for PPE around the world goes up, Canada is keeping up. Our strategy from the beginning has been to aggressively procure PPE in a highly competitive global marketplace and to diversify our supply chains, especially by engaging domestic suppliers, a task that I've been pleased to work on with my colleague, Nav Bains. Now for the deliveries update. Internationally, cargo flights of PPE and other supplies continue to arrive daily. This past week, we received 11 more plane loads of supplies, and our 70th cargo flight is on the way as we speak. 70 flights. This is an incredible effort. Since last week, we have also received 4 additional shipments by sea, arriving in the Port of Vancouver, carrying more than 500,000 liters of hand sanitizer. Given the large volume of supplies ready to be shipped to Canada, transport by sea will become increasingly important over the next months. Chez nous, ici à Canada, par ailleurs,
here in Canada, we are receiving deliveries from Canadian companies every day. More and more, we are relying on the domestic production of some of our most vital supplies.
Pride in the fact that Canadian companies are playing an imperative role in our pandemic response, while sustaining and creating jobs right across the country at a time when Canada needs them most. Companies such as Fluid Energy, a Calgary-based chemical processing and manufacturing firm, was primarily focused on developing and producing environmentally responsible chemical systems prior to COVID. Fluid Energy answered the government's call to action and has stepped up to produce 10 million liters of hand sanitizer for the federal government and Canadians at large. The company has already delivered 5 million liters and will be fulfilling the remainder of the order in the next few weeks. Canadian companies such as Fluid Energy are doing their part, and we are pursuing opportunities with more companies, including businesses led by traditionally underrepresented groups. For example, a recent request for proposal aims to solicit interest specifically from Indigenous-led businesses that can help to provide 25 disposable non-medical masks. We have had an encouraging response so far, and we expect to award contracts in the coming weeks. On all fronts, we are seeking more supplies as deliveries continue to arrive. Let me now provide you with an update on specific items in terms of deliveries. Gowns. This week, we received more than 600,000 gowns, including from Canadian manufacturers like Logistic Unicorn, Yoga Jeans, and Samuelson. This brings our total to more than 4.4 million received, with approximately 700,000 made right here at home. Face shields. We now have more than 17 million received, with most of these face shields made by Canadian companies such as Bauer, Jacobs & Thompson, the Canadian Shield, and Sterling Industries, to name a few. Masques chirurgicaux. Jusqu'à présent, nous avons reçu plus de 100 millions de masques.
Surgical masks. We have received more than 100 million surgical masks to date, with more on the way.
95 masks. We also continue to receive approximately 500,000 N95 respirators every month from 3M, with many more arriving and being delivered. Canada has now distributed more than 3.1 million N95 respirators to the provinces and territories. These are just a few examples of the PPE we have coming in, with a full list contained on our PSPC website. We are also taking action on more testing and tracking of the virus. To help us do just that, I'm pleased to announce that we have finalized a contract with Abbott Laboratories for 140,000 serological test kits. These kits can detect the presence of previous exposure to COVID-19 and will be used for research by the Government of Canada's Immunity Task Force. These kits will play an important role in tracking how widely the virus has spread. Information made available through these kits could also prove valuable in the estimation of potential immunity and vulnerabilities in our populations. With restrictions easing across the country, we know that access to PPE will prove essential for all Canadians. Business owners are opening up their doors and organizations are gearing for employees to return safely to work. They want to know how to find the right PPE to be able to function safely. With this concern in mind, we launched the Ppe Supply Hub last week. The Supply Hub is an internet-based platform that brings together available resources for organizations that are either buying or selling personal protective equipment. It also includes consumer information and questions to be asked prior to purchase. Since its launch, in 1 week alone, people from across the country visited the Supply Hub platform nearly 33,000 times. Stephen Laskowski, president of the Canadian Trucking Alliance, called the hub an invaluable resource and said it will help his industry find what they need to keep everyone safe while we work through this pandemic. We know the need for sourcing PPE is out there, and that's why we at PSPC continue to buy aggressively and why our government is taking action to make sure that Canadians have sufficient amounts of personal protective equipment. In closing, to the thousands and thousands of Canadians who have been able to return to their jobs, a key factor in driving economic recovery, thank you. I wish to once again acknowledge the healthcare workers as well, who are on the front lines keeping Canadians safe. This voice of appreciation cannot be said enough. You are the heroes that have guided us through this pandemic, and Canadians appreciate all that you do. Our government will continue to ensure that you have enough personal protective equipment now and into the future. We are pressing forward and will continue to do so. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you, Anita. And now we will hear from the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, Navdeep Bains. Nav, please.
Thank you very much, Christia, and good afternoon, everyone. Over the past several months, our government has been doing whatever it takes to protect the health of Canadians and the Canadian economy. And I've been extremely proud of how communities across the country have responded as we navigate through this crisis. Nous voulons tous retrouver nos lieux de travail.
We all want to go back to work. We all want to be able to go to school and see our elders.
Call to action. Over 6,400 companies have contacted us to offer their expertise and capacity. And of those 6,400 companies, 700 have retooled to supply personal protective equipment. Nous avons agi rapidement pour lancer un appel à l'action.
We acted quickly. We analyzed letters of proposals and made purchases.
On our work to developing testing and personal protective equipment capacity in Canada. Nous avons signé un contrat avec
We signed a contract with a Montreal company. This company will create magnetic reagents, and this technology is essential for laboratory testing.
I'm happy to say that both CAE and ventilators for Canadians have received an authorization from Health Canada. This important step is another milestone in our Made in Canada project, and it demonstrates the critical importance of securing domestic supply of vital, life-saving equipment to fight COVID-19. We started by bringing together a coalition of Canadian manufacturers to design and produce multiple made-in-Canada ventilators. And now, these firms are able to ramp up manufacturing to deliver on contracts that the government has established with each group for a combined of 20,000 ventilators for these two specific companies. And on masks, the National Research Council is working with Dorma Filtration to adapt Dorma's low-cost reusable N95 masks for mass production to help meet the needs of Canadian healthcare workers. Avant de terminer, j'aimerais souligner
Before closing, I would like to highlight the importance of our researchers and the work that they do throughout our country. Canadians can be proud of them.
In 2018, our government invested the largest amount in Canada's history towards fundamental science. That was a point of pride. And it's those researchers that we count on today and that we will continue to count on in the future. And as a part of our continued effort in this endeavor, Today, I announced more than $492 million in funding by the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada through its Discovery Research Program, which will help over 2,400 researchers across the country. We know that advances in the natural sciences and engineering promise to unlock discoveries that will help address some of our world's biggest challenges. And we're proud to support the women and men making this happen. To everyone who has been contributing to these efforts, our researchers, entrepreneurs, businesses, both large and small, I want to express my sincere gratitude. Thank you very much for stepping up. It's greatly appreciated, and together we'll move forward. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you, Nav. Et Carl, nous sommes prêts maintenant à répondre aux questions.
I think that we are now ready to answer your questions.
3 questions on the phone, 1 question, 1 follow-up, and then we will turn to the room. Operator, over to you.
Thank you. Merci. If you have a question, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. Si vous avez une question, appuyez sur l'étoile 1 sur votre téléphone à clavier. La première question est de Philippe Vincent Foisy de Radio-Canada. La parole est à vous. Please go ahead.
First question from Radio-Canada. Yes, hello. I have a question regarding screening strategies. We heard that it's important to have proper screening strategies. What do you think of what's happening in Quebec, where there was a significant decrease in tests? Does it concern you that there are not enough tests being done for us to have an idea of the situation? Answer. Thank you for the question. This is Dr. New. Throughout Canada, we have a strategy that we agreed on with our colleagues from the provinces and territories. I believe that this strategy is on our website. We changed criteria for people who were symptomatic. At the beginning of the pandemic, provinces and territories thought that only people who were symptomatic with a cough or a fever were posed a risk, but with experience, we have been able to notice that there are a wide range of symptoms, and there are even people who are asymptomatic. So the criteria for screening has been increased in Quebec with any kind of symptoms. If one doesn't feel well, headache, muscle aches, we tell people to perhaps see a doctor or go to a screening site. Secondly, with evidence and with world experience, we know that asymptomatic people could contribute to the spread of the virus. In these circumstances, if there's a case in a long-term care facility where the population is already vulnerable, it might be a good idea to screen all of the other residents and staff in that facility. This is an approach that was well implemented by all provinces and territories. And lastly, in some provinces, there are studies or an approach to offer screening for people who are asymptomatic. There are risks associated with screening people who are asymptomatic, and there are benefits as well, but we'll see the results of these pilot projects or these studies, and at the special advisory committee, we talked about the preliminary results. Currently, there are not a lot of positive results in the asymptomatic population, but we are going to keep following up on these results. I can't necessarily talk about what's going on in Quebec. It's important to look at your local epidemiologists. I think it would be a better question to ask Quebec what is going on in Quebec. Follow-up question?
Dr. Tam,
This is Dr. Tam. I would like to add more data. It's the percentage of positive cases. In Quebec, for the first time, the percentage of positive tests is under 3%. And it's the first time since the start of this pandemic.
Okay, if you want to continue watching this briefing, you can do so at cbc.ca/politics. Let's go inside the West Block now, the House of Commons, where the COVID committee is beginning questions. That was Andrew Scheer.
Who don't understand that this is a global pandemic, and this isn't something we can solve alone. It's something we have to work on with the international community. So the efforts I've been making for several months now, and the conversations I've had with leaders, and through the investments I've made in safety, well, we're going to continue to work with the rest of the world to face these challenges and help Canadians to create a better world. Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister claims he's been making these phone calls to talk about a coordinated response to COVID-19. On June 11th, the Prime Minister had a call with the Sultan of Oman. So I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, will he today condemn Oman's repeated arrest of anti-government protesters?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've continued to be engaged around the world on issues that matter to Canadians, whether it's defeating COVID-19, making investments, or working with partners around the world to advance common causes. We're going to continue to engage in the world because that's what Canadians expect.
But he won't condemn that human rights abuse. I'll give him another chance. On May 6th, the Prime Minister had a phone call with the Emir of Qatar. Will he condemn Qatar's use of slave labor to build a soccer stadium?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has long been engaged in the world, including with people who we don't always agree. But it is important to work together on issues where we do agree and make sure that we're continuing to speak loudly and strongly for human rights, which Canada always does.
So when it comes to personal vanity product, he won't condemn human rights abuses. He just calls them disagreements. Well, on June 11th, the Prime Minister spoke with the President of Rwanda. Will the Prime Minister condemn the murder, frequent arrest, torture, and imprisonment of opposition politicians and investigative journalists? Yes or no?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, over the past months and indeed years, Canada has re-engaged with Africa. We've worked with a number of strong African leaders on issues that matter to people, while at the same time highlighting how our support and our working together can improve the situation around human rights right across the continent. We will continue to work with leaders across Africa.
That was a yes or no question. The Prime Minister can't bring himself to criticize dictators and despots around the world who abuse human rights. And we know that he likes to fund UNRWA to curry favor with nations who are ideologically opposed to Israel's right to exist. Not only has UNRWA helped the terrorist organization Hamas and provided educational materials that attacks Jews, just last year, its leaders were found to have been involved with, quote, sexual misconduct, nepotism, retaliation, discrimination, and other abuses of authority for personal gain to suppress legitimate dissent and to otherwise achieve their personal objective. Why is the Prime Minister funding UNRWA?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we made the decision to restore funding to UNRWA because we know that working towards peace and prosperity in the Middle East go hand in hand. We have brought in greater safeguards and greater accountability for UNRWA through our involvement in it, but we also know that creating better opportunities and better support for people in the region is part of the path towards peace.
Mr. Scheer.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's record on foreign affairs has been a complete disaster. He surrendered to Donald Trump, offering up concession after concession. He went to China to get a free trade deal, and all he came home with was a nickname from the Communist Party that is so offensive, the Speaker has ruled I can't repeat it in this chamber. His erratic behavior during the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks angered our allies in Australia and Japan. Of course, who can forget his disastrous trip to India? So, Mr. Speaker, which one of the
Okay, we're going to leave the House of Commons and bring you to the United Nations, where you can see François-Philippe Champagne. He will be casting the votes on Canada's behalf here. There are 3 votes. The green box is the one box that you want to look for is the purple box. That one right there. That is the vote on the non-permanent members of the Security Council. That, of course, is what Canada is vying for. There are 2 seats up for grabs: Canada, Ireland, and Norway competing for one of those seats. That is our Foreign Affairs Minister. I imagine we know how he's voting, even though these are secret ballots. This orange box here is the President of the General Assembly. And all 3 votes have now been cast, and now Canada has to wait. There are 193 UN ambassadors who have to cast a vote today. You need to get 2/3 of the Assembly in order to win a seat. So Canada just wanted to mark that moment. We are expecting some results later today, but it could go to a second round, and that is highly possible. Let's go back now to the House of Commons. That is the leader of the Bloc Québécois asking some questions now of the Prime Minister.
And this sends a message. It tells how the government has been working for a certain time. In terms of the recent past, I have some questions. For example, while the Prime Minister pretends to be talking to the other premiers in Quebec and the provinces every Thursday, and everything seems to be going well, premiers are saying that in terms of health transfers, things aren't going well. The Prime Minister is refusing to increase health transfers. His current attitude, well, what is it telling Quebec about health care transfers, the Right Honourable Prime Minister? I'd like to thank the Leader of the Bloc for working with us on many initiatives here in this House to help Quebecers and all Canadians. Over the past 3 months, we passed 4 bills with the support of various partners in this House, including the Bloc, to deliver results for our seniors, for our young people, for Canadians. We're going to continue to work. It doesn't mean we'll always agree on everything. Of course, it's a parliament here, but we are going to continue to work together, and I'd like to thank him for his cooperation. Mr. Blanchet. Is he joking? There was nothing that had to do with my question. He kind of smiled. It's funny, they don't really answer your question. At the beginning of this crisis, he transferred $500 million to provinces, and the premiers also spoke together and wanted to talk about health transfers. He should be considering another $500 million transferred for health care transfers. What message does this send Quebec? As my honourable colleague is suggesting, well, we are talking with the provinces about additional health care transfers. We want to restart the economy safely. It is a priority for us all across the country, and that is why our proposal of $14 billion includes health transfers that will help health care in the provinces, and we're going to continue to work hand in hand with premiers. Mr. Blanchet, during a pandemic, this is somewhat lackluster. The provinces aren't saying the same thing as him. This $14 billion has been denounced by the various provinces and the Quebec because there is a systematic approach to encroach on provincial jurisdiction, including that of Quebec. They're saying they're going to defend the interests of Canadians. But is that the message he's sending? Is he defending the interests of Canadians by stepping on provincial jurisdiction? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Chair, all levels of government agree that we have to do everything we can to protect Canadians throughout this pandemic, to restart our economy safely across the country. We are proposing to help provinces with important measures for early child care centres, and to allow people to go back to work, and with help for personal protective equipment and help for municipalities. This involves all levels of government. We have to ensure the safety of Canadians, and that is why we're working with the provinces and territories on this. Mr. Blanchette. He's not working with the provinces and territories. He just says this here. The provinces and territories aren't saying he's doing that. The Prime Minister says, listen, I have a legacy. I want to step on your jurisdiction by using federal funds, which comes from the provinces. There's no agreement. There's been no accord signed. This is clear interference. When we've told the federal government, here is a series of proposals that shows a spirit of cooperation. It says what Quebec is asking for its province. And they shut the door on us, and they thought that we would just vote with them. Is that the Prime Minister's meaning of cooperation? Is that the message she's sending Quebec and Quebecers? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Chair, we understand completely that for political reasons and ideological reasons, the Bloc always wants to show that the relationship between the federal government and the provinces isn't working, notably that of Quebec. But our conversations are continuing with the provinces, including Quebec. Positive discussions are underway, and we're working together to ensure the health and safety of all Canadians. And that's exactly what we are doing. We won't always agree, of course, but we are having tangible conversations which will help Canadians by implementing measures to restart our economy safely. We'll now move on to Mr. Singh.
Mr. Speaker, families were weeks away from not knowing if they could put food on the table before the government finally extended the benefits to help Canadians out. Now, this should never have happened. Families should never have been worried about where they were going to get support weeks away from their support running out. What is the plan for August for families that may not be able to go back to work?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the Honourable Leader of the NDP. This should never have happened. We do not want to be finding ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic, and yet we are. And every step of the way, as a government, we have been responding to be there for Canadians, to help them, modifying, adjusting, expanding, and extending, in this case, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit for an additional 8 weeks to make sure that Canadians are supported through this difficult time.
Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister accept and admit that the EI system is broken for most Canadians?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, one of the things this pandemic has shown is we need to do better around vulnerable Canadians, and we need to look at what we can do right now to help people, but we also need to look at the longer term, including
to Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh.
Will the Prime Minister fix EI so it helps all Canadians in need?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're always happy to move forward on improvements to our systems to help more Canadians, and that's something that we're very much looking at every single day. We're
to Mr. Singh.
Will the Prime Minister enhance employment insurance so we can help all those in need? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Chair, our priority right now is helping people who need help immediately. Enhancements and modifications to help more people. We're going to now go to Mr. Singh.
Canadians living with disabilities have been ignored throughout this pandemic. We've forced and pushed the government to commit to helping Canadians living with disabilities almost 2 months ago. But still there is no help for them. When will Canadians living with disabilities get the help they need?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, from the beginning of this pandemic, the Minister of Canadians with Disabilities has worked with the community, worked to help out, and we as a government have stepped up on helping many, many people. There is more to do, which is why we put forward legislation to send extra help to people with disabilities. Unfortunately, politics got in the way of that. We will continue to work on how to help people with disabilities.
You're saying.
One moment, there is a point of order. Ms. LaRoche? Inaudible for the interpreter.
I'm going to start speaking in English to see if everything's being translated. Est-ce que c'est traduit?
Is this being interpreted? When I speak in English, can you hear me in French?
I'm speaking, il faut parler, I have to speak in English. Can you understand? Is it being translated? OK, parfait, c'est arrangé.
Perfect. The problem has been solved. Thank you very much.
Ça l'aide beaucoup, oui, quand on parle.
Yes, it helps to speak the correct language.
We'll now proceed to Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. New Democrats are prepared to support legislation that helps all Canadians living with disabilities. When will the government bring forward legislation that helps them? We will support that legislation right away.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we brought forward such legislation last week. Unfortunately, the Conservatives denied unanimous consent to be able to move forward to help people with disabilities with an extra $600.
Back to Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh.
It's been over 2 months. Canadians with disabilities need that help right away. And it's a matter of choices that this government's making in terms of who they're choosing to help and who they're not helping. We just learned today, what we've known for a while, that the wealthiest 1% of Canadians own as much as the bottom 40%. Will the Prime Minister make a choice to make the super wealthy pay their fair share?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, since we came to office, we've moved forward on making the tax system fairer, on ensuring that everyone pays their parts. The first things we did was raise taxes for the wealthiest 1% so we could lower them for the middle class and people working hard to join it. We will continue to focus on helping vulnerable Canadians in this pandemic and going forward.
Okay, I think we're going to leave the rest of this. If you want to keep listening, you can do that at cbc.ca/politics. Important to note that question there from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh around the disability top-up that many Canadians were hoping to receive soon. It was part of the legislation that did not move forward last week, but the government is still working on ways to get that to Canadians, and we'll continue to track that story, an important story, of course. But I wanted to talk about something that you've probably seen across social media channels, your social media channels certainly, and other places over the past 24 hours. And it's the man who helped create and co-hosted the Canadian health and fitness segment Body Break, who decided to reveal some startling news. In a YouTube video, Hal Johnson says the series was started to combat racism. Take a listen.
You think that Body Break was started because of fitness. Well, it wasn't. It was started to combat racism. That was the #1 reason that we started Body Break, Joanne and I. I thought, how can I change things? How can I make that we can all live, work, and play together? And there won't be this attitude that white and black and Asian and persons with disabilities and male, female, we all can't be together. So I came up with this idea, and the idea is Body Break.
Johnson goes on to tell the story that inspired that decision. He says it started with a job offer. He was hired and then fired. And we've reached Hal Johnson today in Oakville. What a pleasure to see you, Hal Johnson. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
So why did you decide to share this story? Because, I mean, I grew up with Body Break, as so many people did. It would never have occurred to me, I would never have known that you started it because you essentially lost another job that you shouldn't have lost.
Yeah, it was a series of things over the years that had occurred. And I really had it, enough was enough. And how can we change the landscape? How can we make it that we can all, as I say, live, work, and play together? And so I had just met Joanne, which really inspired the idea for the show that we could. And so I talked to her, we put it together, and what we really want to show, what we wanted to do, was really never talk about it. Just show that people can live together. So show I'm black and Joanne's white, I'm black and Irish and Joanne's German and Italian. we don't have to talk about it, we'll just show it. And that's why if you watch our Body Break episodes, and we're starting to put a lot of them up on YouTube, all the old ones, you'll see that there's a lot of different nationalities in our episodes and persons with disabilities. And that is not by accident. Thinking that if we gave you a little bit of medicine, a little bit of, that you'd be able to take it, ingest it, and you'd become better and understanding that we can, so that having a black couple, or black and white people together, that's normal. And we're hearing on YouTube all the comments from people saying that they grew up with us and they thought it was normal, Hal and Joe, a black and white person being together. And that's really, really heartening.
The story that you told, though, in the video dates back to 1988 when you wanted to be a sports reporter at TSN and they hired you. But maybe you can just, for people that haven't seen your whole video, tell them what happened after that.
Well, they hired me at 11 o'clock in the morning, a lovely gentleman named Jack Hutchinson, and he called me in tears at 2 o'clock, and he said he can't hire me because they already have another reporter, black reporter. His name is Mark Jones, who went on to ESPN and is a great reporter down there. And they didn't want to have two. The higher ups didn't want to have two black reporters at the same time. And so that afternoon, I went home and I actually told Joanne about that had occurred. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't frustrated about that. I was disappointed, but I was always told by my parents and shown that, there's always a way. And as tough as it has been for me, it's been a piece of cake compared to what they went through. So people ask me, how were you able to get through that? And I go, well, they got through a lot worse than I ever did. I had to go through. So, just literally just suck it up and do it.
So TSN, even though this happened in 1988, yesterday did issue an apology. I'll just read a little bit of it to our viewers. They say they apologize to you for the racism you experienced, a shameful part of our past, and we thank him for sharing his story as a reminder of racism in Canadian media that continues today. Did that mean anything? Did that change anything for you, the fact that they recognized what had happened, that they apologized for it?
Well, to me personally, they didn't need to do it. I'm not a victim. I'm not bitter. Everything turned out okay. And so I don't have any ill will towards TSN at all, or CTV. I mean, they were fine. I think what it does do is it puts, I think the landscape of media is going to change. I think hopefully the landscape of all the C-suites, they realize that you should have somebody at the table that is reflective of the community that you're serving. Yeah. And so I think having another perspective is certainly helpful.
Isn't it, do you think, would you have thought all those years ago that we would still be at this place where there wasn't enough representation in media, certainly, but in other places as well? Would you have hoped that things would have gotten further? Would you have expected that to happen?
Well, I don't know if expected, hoped, definitely. Yeah. But it's, things take a long time to change. Now, the pandemic colliding with George Floyd and all of these other issues have changes happening really quick, a lot quicker. And my dad, who's 88, says he's more hopeful now than he's ever been before. So, I think that's encouraging. If my dad, who's been through a lot more than I, is encouraged and hopeful, I think things are really going to change. And I put this in quotations, as tough as it is in Canada, it's much worse in the States. And I lived in the States for 10 years, and I say in Canada there's a lot of there is prejudice. In the States there's racism, there's hate, and it's a very different country. And as I say, I lived there 10 years. I know what it's about. It's when you cross that border, I'm relaxed. When I'm in the U.S. and I'm driving, I feel hunted. I do not feel that way when I'm in Canada.
Wow, but you still see places for us to do work, obviously, because there's been a conversation, as you know, for the past couple of weeks about systemic racism and changes that need to happen in this country too.
Absolutely. I've been in literally hundreds of meetings with advertising agencies, companies. And I've rarely seen, especially in PR agencies, advertising agencies, people of color. And so if they're advertising, if they're promoting How can they have a perspective? How can they understand? I was talking on a sports radio show today. I said, wouldn't it be different for having a black reporter talking to a black athlete and asking them, what's it like? How is it different in Canada than it is in the U.S. as it for a black athlete? A black reporter could ask that question to a black athlete, and he can get even more information. And so I think that bring a collective group of people to the table. People with disabilities would be fantastic to have at the table, can enrich all of our lives. And I think why not? But the why not is that people don't want to give up power. And also, when you hire people, you often hire people that look like you. And that are a reflection of you.
Hal, I've run out of time, but I also have to tell you, I'm such a fangirl, and I love you and Joanne, and say hi to her for me.
I will, and I'm a fan of yours, Rosie. Absolutely.
Hal Johnson, I'm Rosemary Barton. This is CBC News Network.